February 1945. The war in Europe is in its final, brutal act. For the men of General George S. Patton's Third Army, the end feels tantalizingly close. They've punched through the Siegfried Line, that vaunted west wall of Hitler's Germany, and are now driving deep into the heart of the enemy's homeland. The mood is a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Every mile gained is a mile closer to home, but the cost is paid in blood and steel. The German landscape scrolls by, a blur of shattered towns and winter-scarred fields. The advance has been lightning fast, a testament to Patton's aggressive, forward-leaning doctrine. But this rapid push comes with a price. Supply lines, the lifeblood of any army, are stretched to their breaking point. Convoys of the legendary Red Bull express race day and night to keep the tanks fueled and the guns fed. But it's a desperate, never-ending struggle against distance and mud. Ammunition is rationed. Food is sometimes scarce. The cold is a constant, gnawing enemy that seeps into your bones and never leaves. For the G is on the front line. The big picture is lost in the immediate, terrifying reality of combat. They don't know about the high-level strategy or the logistical nightmares. Their world is the next hedgerow, the next stone, the next machine gun nest. They fight for the man next to them, for a letter from home, for the simple dream of seeing the sun rise one more time. The resistance they face is growing more ferocious. These aren't the demoralized troops they fought in France. Here, on their own soil, the Germans fight with a desperate, cornered animal ferocity. Old men from the Volkssturm, boys from the Hitler Youth, and battle-hardened veterans are thrown into the meat grinder, determined to defend every inch of the fatherland. The American advance, which had seemed so unstoppable, begins so slow. It's a grueling, attritional fight. Small skirmishes erupt constantly, flaring up in quiet-looking forests and seemingly abandoned villages. The casualty rates climb. Every road could be mined. Every window could hide a sniper. The tension is a physical thing you can taste in the air. The men are weary, their nerves frayed. They've seen too much, lost too many friends. Yet, they push on. They have to. Meanwhile, in the Furtbunker deep beneath the Rubel of Berlin, a different kind of reality is taking shape. Adolf Hitler, increasingly detached from the grim truth of his collapsing empire, is planning one final, desperate gamble. He believes he can still turn the tide, that a decisive blow against the advancing Allies will shatter their coalition and force a negotiated peace. He scours his maps, his hands trembling, and his eyes fixate on a weak point. A section of the American line he believes is overextended and vulnerable. This isn't a grand, sweeping offensive like the Battle of the Bulge. This is something more focused, more surgical, and born of sheer desperation. He gathers the last of his elite units, the remnants of his once mighty panzer divisions, and gives them a singular, audacious objective. The target is not a major city or a strategic fortress. It's a small, seemingly insignificant town, a place most mapmakers would overlook, a dot on the map called The Americans holding the line near Statkill have no idea what's coming. For them, it's just another cold, miserable day in a long, miserable war. They are tired, they are short on supplies, and they believe the worst is behind them. They are unaware that the full, concentrated fury of Hitler's last gasp is about to descend upon them. The German war machine, thought to be on its last legs, is coiling for one final strike. The panzers are gathering in the forests, their engines rumbling softly in the pre-dawn quiet. The storm is coming. And the small town of Statkill, a name nobody knew, is about to become the epicenter of a brutal, decisive battle that would test the limits of American courage. The road into Germany has led them here, to a collision course with an enemy that refuses to die. March 1st, 1945. The air over the Western Front is thick with the scent of cordite and the coming spring. The Allied war machine, a leviathan of steel and fire, grinds relentlessly eastward. But standing in its path, a dark and fanatical force is preparing to make its last, most desperate stand. This is the story of the First SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Born from the shadows of the Weimar Republic, they began as a small, hand-picked group of men, sworn not to Germany, but to one man alone. Adolf Hitler. They were his personal Praetorian Guard, the living embodiment of the Nazi ideal. Clad in immaculate black uniforms, they were a symbol of power, loyalty, and unwavering devotion. But by 1945, the parade grounds of Berlin were a distant memory. The Leibstandarte had been forged and reforged in the crucible of the Eastern Front, a brutal, unforgiving war that had stripped away all but the most hardened fanatics. These were not fresh-faced conscripts. They were the veterans of Kharkov, where they had clawed back a city from the brink, fighting block by bloody block. They were the survivors of the Kursk salient, the largest tank battle in human history, a maelstrom of fire and steel that had bled the Panzerwaffe. They had weathered the storm of Normandy, facing the full might of the Allied invasion, their Tiger and Panther tanks becoming feared predators in the dense hedgerows of the Buch. Through years of relentless combat, the Leibstandarte had earned a fearsome reputation. They were known for their tactical brilliance, their aggression, and a chilling ruthlessness that often crossed the line into outright atrocity. Their motto, Meine Ehre Detreue, my honoris loyalty, was a sacred vow, a justification for acts that would forever stain their name. They were masters of the lightning attack, the blitzkrieg, but they were equally adept at stubborn, fanatical defense. For them, retreat was not an option. Surrender was a betrayal, but the war had taken its toll. The division that once numbered over 20,000 elite soldiers was now a shadow of its former self. Their ranks were filled with grim-faced veterans, boys barely old enough to shave, and transfers from the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine who had never seen the inside of a tank. Their once mighty panzer regiments were depleted. Instead of endless columns of panthers and tigers, they now fielded a hodgepodge of vehicles, many battle-scarred and hastily repaired. Fuel was scarce, ammunition rationed, and the skies above belonged to the Allied air forces, the dreaded Jabostis fighter bombers that hunted German armor with impunity. Yet, what they lacked in numbers and material, they made up for in something far more intangible and dangerous: ideology. The men of the Leibstandarte were not just soldiers. They were believers. They had been indoctrinated from a young age in the cult of National Socialism. They truly believed they were the master race, fighting a righteous war against a world of inferior enemies. This fanaticism gave them a terrifying resolve. They would fight to the last man, the last bullet, convinced that their sacrifice would somehow turn the tide and grant Germany the final victory, the Endsieg, that their Führer had promised. Their commanders were men cut from the same cloth. Figures like Wilhelm Monk, a veteran from the very beginning, known for his brutality and unflinching loyalty to the cause. These officers led from the front, sharing the same risks as their men and demanding nothing less than total commitment. The bond between officers and enlisted men in the Waffen-SS was legendary, forged in the heat of 100 battles. It was a brotherhood of the damned, united by shared experience and a shared dark ideology. Now, in the dying days of the Reich, they received a final, impossible order. General George S. Patton's Third Army, a spearhead of American power, was carving its way through the heart of Germany. Patton, a commander as aggressive and relentless as any in the SS, was a threat that had to be stopped. The Leibstandarte, along with the remnants of other elite SS divisions, was tasked with halting his advance. It was a suicide mission, a directive to throw themselves against an overwhelming force, to buy the crumbling Reich just a few more weeks, perhaps even days, of existence. As they moved into their defensive positions, the men of the Leibstandarte knew what was at stake. They cleaned their rifles, serviced their panzers, and checked their ammunition. There was no hope of victory, no illusion of survival. There was only the mission. They were the Führer's final fire brigade, sent to quench a raging inferno with blood. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by a collapsing world. But they were still the Leibstandarte. And they would meet the Americans with the same ferocity and fanaticism they had shown on every battlefield from the frozen steppes of Russia to the bloody fields of France. The final, brutal chapter of their story was about to be written: the Rhine. For the Allied armies in the West, it was the last great barrier, the final river to cross, before plunging into the heart of Germany. By March 1945, the war in Europe was clearly in its final, bloody chapter. But crossing the Rhine would be no simple task. The Germans knew its importance, and they would defend it with everything they had left. Our story today focuses on one small but crucial part of this massive front, a place called Statkill. This wasn't a major city or a strategic fortress, but a quiet valley town that was about to become the epicenter of a desperate German camp. The American units holding the line here, part of the 9th Armored Division, were battle-hardened, but they were about to face something they hadn't seen in months. A full-blown German panzer assault. As the sun began to hint at its arrival on March 6, 1945, a thick, cold mist blanketed the valley. It was the kind of fog that swallows sound and plays tricks on the eyes. For the American soldiers in their foxholes and listening posts, it was an eerie, unsettling morning. The world had shrunk to just a few feet in front of them. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Out in that gray void, routine patrols were sent forward to scout the no-man's land between the lines. A squad here, a couple of soldiers there, moving cautiously into the fog. But then, something strange happened. They didn't come back. Radio checks went unanswered. One moment they were there, swallowed by the mist. The next, just silence. A chilling, unnerving silence. The tension in the American lines ratcheted up. Every soldier gripped their rifle a little tighter, their eyes straining to pierce the impenetrable haze. Something was wrong. The veteran NCOs could feel it in their bones. This wasn't the usual morning quiet. This was the calm before the storm. They passed the word down the line. Stay alert. Something's coming, and then they heard it. At first, it was just a low, indistinct vibration. A rumble you could feel more in your chest than you could hear with your ears. It was easy to dismiss at first, maybe a friendly supply convoy on a distant road. But the sound grew. It wasn't the sound of trucks. It was deeper, more menacing. It was the clatter of metal treads on frozen earth, the growl of powerful engines. And it wasn't one or two, it was dozens. The rumble intensified, coming from directly ahead, from within the fog-shrouded forest. It was the sound of heavy armor on the move. The Americans knew what this meant. The Germans were attacking. Through their binoculars, the sentries stared into the shifting gray, their hearts pounding. Slowly, monstrous shapes began to emerge from the mist. At first, they were just dark, blurry silhouettes, like great beasts, moving through the primordial fog. But as they crept closer, their features became terrifyingly clear. Long, powerful cannon barrels. Thick, sloped armor plates, and on their sides, the stark, black cross of the These weren't just any tanks. These were the big cats. Panthers and tigers, the most feared German armor of the war. Dozens of them creeping forward through the trees, their engines now a deafening roar that shook the very ground. They weren't rushing. They were advancing with a deliberate, terrifying confidence, their turrets scanning for targets, for the American G is in their foxholes. This was a waking nightmare. They were infantrymen and tankers with Sherman tanks, formidable in their own right, but facing a concentration of panthers and tigers like this was a different game entirely. The black crosses grew larger and larger, emerging from the morning haze like specters of death. The radios crackled to life with frantic, urgent calls. Panzers. Panzers in the woods. Heavy armor. Tigers and panthers. Moving on our position, there was no more uncertainty. No more eerie silence. The moment of truth had arrived. The Battle of Statkill had begun. The first shots ripped through the air with a deafening crack. An American anti-tank gun, hidden in a destroyed farmhouse, opened fire. The tracer round zipped through the fog and clanged harmlessly off the frontal armor of a lead Tiger tank. The giant machine didn't even seem to notice. It just kept coming. Then, the Tiger's main gun flashed. An 88mm shell screamed across the short distance and slammed into the farmhouse. The building erupted in a cloud of splintered wood, stone, and dust. The anti-tank gun fell silent. One shot, one kill. The message was clear. This would be a brutal, desperate fight for survival. All along the American line, weapons opened up, machine guns chattered, rifles cracked, and the 75mm cannons of the Sherman tanks began to bark. The Shermans, agile and reliable, moved to counter the threat. Their crews, knowing they were outgunned, but determined to hold their ground. They were the Cobras, tasked with hunting the German Tigers. The valley, once quiet and shrouded in mist, was now a chaotic hell of explosions, smoke, and the screech of metal. Tracer rounds, red and green, crisscrossed the battlefield, painting deadly lines through the dissipating fog. The German Panthers, using their superior guns and optics, began picking off American positions from a distance. Their long 75mm cannons were lethally accurate, but the Americans were not an easy target. They used the terrain to their advantage, digging in deep and setting up kill zones. Tank destroyers, the M10s and M18 Hellcats, lay in ambush, waiting for the perfect side shot on the heavily armored German beasts. A shot to the flank or the rear of a Panther or Tiger could be fatal, and the American crews were masters of maneuver and ambush tactics. One young Sherman commander, Sergeant Jack Davis, saw a Panther cresting a small ridge, its side exposed for just a moment. "Gunner, traverse right." Target, Panther, on the ridge. "Fire." His gunner didn't hesitate. The Sherman rocked back as its cannon fired. The shell struck the Panther's thinner side armor, and a plume of black smoke erupted from its turret. A cheer went up from Davis's crew, a small victory in a sea of chaos. But for every German tank they knocked out, another two seemed to take its place. The German assault was relentless. They pushed forward, their infantry moving up behind the steel behemoths, firing machine pistols and throwing grenades. The fighting devolved into a series of desperate, close-quarters engagements. It was foxhole against tank, bazooka against 88mm cannon. The battle raged for hours. The morning haze was burned away not by the sun, but by the fire and smoke of combat. The valley floor became a graveyard of burning steel, littered with the wreckage of both American Shermans and German Panthers. The initial shock of the German assault had been absorbed, but the line was bending. It was threatening to break. The American commanders, coordinating from their command posts just behind the front, knew they were in a critical situation. Losing Statkill would open a dangerous gap in the Allied front, potentially delaying the entire push to the Rhine. They called in everything they had: artillery, air support, and every available reserve. The sky soon filled with the roar of P-47 Thunderbolts. The Jabos, as the Germans called them, swooped down on the valley like birds of prey, their machine guns strafing the German infantry and their rockets slamming into the panzers. The tide of the battle began to slowly, painfully, turn. The combined arms approach of the Americans, the synergy of infantry, armor, artillery, and air power, was their greatest strength. By late afternoon, the German attack had lost its momentum. They had suffered heavy losses and could not break the stubborn American defense. The remaining Panthers and Tigers, battered and low on fuel and ammunition, began to pull back into the cover of the forest. The rumble of their engines faded, replaced by the crackle of burning wreckage and the cries of the wounded. The Battle of Statkill was over. The Americans had held the line, but the cost was high. The valley was scarred. The quiet town of Statkill was now a ruin, and many good soldiers on both sides would never see another dawn. It was a microcosm of the brutal fighting all along the Western Front in those final months of the war. A desperate German gamble met by determined Allied resistance. This battle, though small in the grand scheme of the war, was a testament to the courage and resilience of the soldiers who fought there. They faced down the most feared weapons of the German army and refused to break. They held the line, ensuring the advance to the Rhine could continue, one bloody step at a time. The storm had passed, but the war was far from over. The morning of March 6th, 1945, dawned cold and gray over the Western Front. For the American soldiers hunkered down in their positions, it felt like just another day in a long, grueling war. But this was no ordinary morning. Suddenly, the entire world exploded. A thunderous roar ripped through the air as a massive artillery barrage, orchestrated by the elite SS divisions, slammed into the American lines. The ground shook violently, trees were splintered into a million pieces, and the air filled with the shriek of incoming shells and the acrid smell of cordite. The shelling was relentless, a steel hailstorm designed not just to destroy, but to terrorize. American positions, meticulously prepared, were pulverized in minutes. Foxholes collapsed, bunkers were turned into craters, and the carefully laid communication lines that connected units were instantly plunging the frontline troops into a terrifying state of isolation. No orders could get in, no reports could get out. Each man was on his own, surrounded by a maelstrom of fire and death, and through the smoke and chaos, a new, more terrifying sound began to grow. The deep, guttural rumble of heavy engines. Out of the morning mist they came, monstrous silhouettes growing larger and more menacing with every second. German panzer tanks, including the dreaded Panthers and Tigers, advanced in a seemingly endless wave. For every American Sherman tank, there were at least 2 of these steel beasts lumbering towards them. The Shermans, often nicknamed Ronsons, because they tended to light up so easily when hit, were outgunned and The situation looked utterly hopeless. Panic began to set in. How could they possibly survive this onslaught? In the midst of this pandemonium, inside the cramped, vibrating steel hull of a Sherman tank, a young officer named Lieutenant Harris was trying to make sense of the chaos. He could hear the desperate screams of his fellow soldiers over the radio before it went dead. He saw friendly tanks get hit, erupting into balls of fire. His own tank rocked from near misses, the sound of shrapnel pinging off the armor like deadly rain. His gunner was frantically scanning for targets. His loader stood ready, but they were exposed, vulnerable, and facing overwhelming odds. Retreat wasn't an option. They'd be picked off one by one. Fighting alone was suicide. Harris knew he had to do something radical, something that wasn't in any training manual. He grabbed the radio handset for his internal tank platoon net, hoping it still worked. "All tanks in my platoon, listen up. Form on me. Form on me. Now," he yelled over the din. His voice was steady, cutting through the fear that threatened to paralyze them all. One by one, the surviving tanks in his unit began to respond, maneuvering through the churned-up mud and wreckage to converge on his position. They didn't know the plan, but they trusted their commander. Form a circle. Back to back. Interlock your armor. Harris commanded. It was a crazy idea, born of pure desperation. A circle of tanks. It went against all conventional wisdom. Normally, tanks fought in lines, using maneuverability to their advantage. But here, with no room to run and no escape, their only hope was to create an unbreakable strongpoint. His men, without hesitation, followed the order. Slowly, clumsily, under a constant hail of fire, the 4 remaining Sherman tanks in his platoon backed up against each other, their hulls grinding as they formed a tight, 360-degree fortress of steel. This was the birth of the armored hedgehog. From the outside, it looked like a cluster of cornered animals, but from the inside, it was a work of tactical genius. Each tank's cannon and machine guns covered a different arc of fire. There were no blind spots, no vulnerable flanks. Any German tank that approached would face the combined firepower of multiple Shermans. The loader in Harris's tank slammed a shell into the breach. Gunner, traverse right. Tiger, 2 o'clock. The 75mm cannon roared, and for the first time that morning, it was an American shell that found its mark, striking a German panzer and causing it to grind to a halt. The Germans were stunned. They had expected a disorganized rout, an easy victory. Instead, they were met with a disciplined, interlocking field of fire. They advanced, trying to find a weak point, but every angle of attack was met with a fusillade of armor-piercing rounds. The American gunners, no longer panicked, began to work with cold, deadly efficiency. Calls went out inside the hedgehog. Panzer at 9 o'clock. Target spotted, 1 o'clock. Engaging. The barrels of the Shermans swiveled and fired a synchronized dance of destruction. The hedgehog was holding. It was bleeding. Shells were still hammering their armor, but it was not breaking. Lieutenant Harris, peering through his periscope, saw the German advance falter. The initial shock and awe of their attack had been absorbed by this small, defiant circle of steel. He knew they couldn't hold out forever. They were low on ammunition, and their armor wouldn't withstand this punishment indefinitely. But they had done the impossible. They had stopped the blitzkrieg. In its tracks, they had turned a death trap into a fortress. They had bought precious time for the rear echelons to regroup and organize a counter. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, the armored hedgehog had given the Americans a fighting chance. The legend of the armored hedgehog would be told and retold by soldiers who survived that day. It became a symbol of American ingenuity and grit in the face of impossible odds. It was a tactic born not in a classroom or a strategy meeting, but in the crucible of combat by a young lieutenant who refused to accept defeat. The first clash, on that brutal morning of March 6th, was a testament to the idea that even when outnumbered and outgunned, courage and clear thinking could forge victory from the very jaws of disaster. As the sun dipped below the horizon on March 6, 1945, a cold twilight settled over the Hungarian landscape. For the exhausted American soldiers, dug in near Lake Balaton, the day's relative quiet felt like a fragile truce. But it was only the calm before a storm of steel and fire. In the gathering darkness, the rumble started, a low, guttural growl that shook the very earth. It was the sound of German armor on the move. This was it. The long-awaited German offensive, codenamed Operation Spring Awakening, was about to begin. For Hitler, this was a desperate, final gamble on the Eastern Front, a massive armored thrust designed to reclaim the Hungarian oil fields and shatter the Soviet advance toward Vienna. Leading the charge were the elite Waffen-SS Panzer Divisions, the pride of the Third Reich, including the legendary First SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte. These were hardened veterans, equipped with the most fearsome tanks of the war, the Panther and the hulking Tiger II. Their orders were simple: break the American lines, drive a wedge through the Allied front, and restore German fortunes in the east. The American G's huddled in their foxholes, their breath misting in the frigid air. They were outnumbered and outgunned, a mix of battle-hardened infantry and green replacements who had never seen combat. They had spent days digging in, laying mines, and sighting their anti-tank guns, bazookas, and machine guns. They knew the SS were coming. The tension was a physical thing, a tight knot in the stomach of every soldier. They listened to the clanking of tank tracks, and the murmur of German voices carried on the wind. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching enemy. They were the thin line standing between the SS and a catastrophic breakthrough. They were tired. They were cold, but they were ready. They had been told to hold this line at all costs, and they were determined not to yield an inch. The stage was set for a titanic clash, a brutal night battle that would decide the fate of the front. Suddenly, the night erupted. Green and red flares shot into the sky, casting an airy spectral glow over the battlefield. The German artillery opened up, a deafening barrage that tore through the American positions. Shells screamed overhead, exploding in geysers of dirt and shrapnel. Under the cover of this rolling thunder, the silhouettes of tanks emerged from the darkness. Panthers, their long 88mm guns pointing forward like accusatory fingers, advanced in a disciplined wedge formation. Behind them, waves of Panzer Grenadiers in their distinctive camouflage smocks moved forward, their rifles at the ready. They moved with a chilling efficiency, the textbook definition of a commandarm's assault. The SS doctrine was all about shock and awe, overwhelming the enemy with concentrated force and speed. They expected the Americans to break and run, just as so many had before them. They were the hunters, and the prey was in their sights. The German commanders watched through their binoculars, confident that this first attack would shatter the American will to fight. But the Americans didn't break. They held their fire, their discipline ironclad. Every NCO, every officer, had passed down the same order. Wait for the signal. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Let them walk into the kill zone. The German tanks rumbled closer, their engines roaring, their tracks chewing up the frozen ground. They passed the first line of tripwires, then the second. The leading Panthers were now less than 200 yards away, their massive forms filling the sights of the hidden American anti-tank guns. The infantry was almost on top of the American foxholes. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and nervous sweat. Still, the Americans waited. It was a test of nerve, unlike any other. A single premature shot could give away their positions and ruin the entire ambush. Every soldier gripped their weapon, their knuckles white, their heart pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. The moments stretched into an eternity. Then the signal came. A single white flare shot into the sky, and in that instant, the entire American front line exploded in a symphony of destruction. Every gun, every cannon, every machine gun opened fire simultaneously. A storm of tracers crisscrossed the night, a dense web of red and green light that illuminated the battlefield in flashes. 57mm anti-tank guns, perfectly positioned on the flanks, slammed armor-piercing rounds into the vulnerable side armor of the Panthers. Bazooka teams popped up from their holes, firing rockets that streaked toward the German tanks with a terrifying hiss. The lead Panther shuddered as multiple rounds struck it at once. Its armor, so formidable from the front, was torn open like paper. A bright orange flame erupted from its turret, followed by a plume of thick, black smoke. It ground to a halt, a burning monument to the failure of the attack. The meticulously planned German assault dissolved into chaos. One after another, the Panthers were hit. Some exploded in catastrophic fireballs, their ammunition cooking off and sending the turret flying into the air. Others simply stopped, their crews either killed or bailing out into the inferno. The Panzer Grenadiers, who had been advancing with such confidence just moments before, were caught in a brutal crossfire. Heavy machine guns scythed through their ranks, cutting men down in droves. Mortar rounds rained down, plastering their positions and forcing them to dive for any cover they could find. Their rigid formation, their greatest strength, shattered completely. Men screamed, shouted orders that were lost in the cacophony, and scrambled for their lives. The hunters had walked straight into a perfectly laid trap. They were no longer the aggressors. They were the hunted, caught in a meat grinder of American firepower. The battle raged 4 hours. A desperate, close-quarters struggle fought in the flickering light of burning tanks. American infantrymen counterattacked, surging out of their foxholes to engage the scattered and disorganized German survivors. Grenades were thrown, bayonets were fixed, and brutal hand-to-hand fights broke out in the shell craters and ditches that scarred the landscape. The SS, known for their fanaticism, fought back with ferocious tenacity, but they were leaderless. Their officers among the first to be cut down, their armored support burning behind them. The momentum had shifted entirely. The psychological shock for the SS was immense. They had expected a swift victory, a rollover of what they perceived as inferior troops. Instead, they had been stopped dead in their tracks and systematically torn apart. The myth of SS invincibility was being dismantled, piece by piece, under the cold Hungarian sky. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the firing started to die down. The surviving Germans, what few were left, began a panicked retreat, melting back into the darkness from which they came. The battlefield was a vision from hell. The hulks of nearly a dozen Panther tanks burned fiercely, their blackened frames silhouetted against the pale morning light. The ground was littered with the wreckage of the assault discarded weapons, equipment, and the bodies of fallen soldiers. The Americans, though exhausted and having taken their own casualties, had held the line. They had faced the best the Third Reich could throw at them and had not only survived, but triumphed. The great counterattack, Hitler's last hope in the East, had been broken on its very first night. This ambush was more than just a successful defensive action. It was a devastating blow to the morale and fighting capability of the elite Waffen-SS. The price of victory was high, but the price of defeat would have been unimaginable. The aftermath of the battle was a grim accounting. American soldiers walked through the smoldering wreckage, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes wide with a mixture of relief and horror. They checked on their wounded comrades and collected the dog tags of the fallen. They looked out over the field of destruction they had wrought, a testament to their courage and discipline. The German losses were staggering. The SS Panzer Division had lost a significant portion of its armored strength in a single night-s action, a blow from which it would never truly recover. Operation Spring Awakening would continue for a few more days, sputtering forward in a series of costly and futile attacks. But the back of the offensive had been broken here, in this nocturnal ambush. The momentum was gone, the element of surprise lost forever. The failure here near Lake Balaton marked the beginning of the end for the German war machine on the Eastern Front. This battle was a crucial turning point, a demonstration that well-prepared, determined infantry could defeat even the most feared armored forces. The American GIs had proven their mettle in the most extreme circumstances. Their victory was a testament not to superior technology, but to superior tactics, unbreakable discipline, and the sheer grit of the common soldier. They had stared into the face of the enemy's elite and had not flinched. The story of this night ambush is a powerful reminder of the incredible sacrifices made by the Allied soldiers who fought to turn the tide of the war. They turned the hunter into the hunted and helped pave the way for the final victory in Europe. Thank you for watching. As the sun bled out on the horizon of March 6, 1945, the day's brutal fighting didn't just end, it transformed. The battlefield, a chaotic landscape of shattered farms and cratered fields, descended into a primal darkness, punctuated by the horrific symphony of war. This wasn't a pause, it was an escalation. This was the night of fire. Imagine the scene, the air, thick with the smell of cordite and scorched earth, now carried the desperate cries of the wounded, voices lost in the vast, terrifying dark. For the American soldiers of the 4th Armored Division, every shadow held a potential threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching enemy. They were deep in enemy territory, near the German town of Lübeck, having just fought a ferocious battle against the elite 17th SS Panzer Division. The day had been won, but the night was a different beast altogether. From the darkness, the guttural roar of German engines would occasionally tear through the night, a chilling reminder that the enemy was still there, regrouping, probing for weakness. But the most haunting sights were the burning tanks. German Panthers and American Shermans, once mighty steel beasts, were now funeral pyres. They burned 4 hours, their metal skeletons glowing and angry, malevolent red against the black sky. And then came the fireworks. Not the celebratory kind, but the deadly, unpredictable cooking off of ammunition. As the intense heat inside the burning hulls reached the stored shells, they would detonate one by one, a deafening crack, a flash of white-hot light, and a shower of deadly shrapnel would arc across the battlefield. It was a terrifying, random lottery of death that kept everyone pinned down, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. For the young GIs huddled in their foxholes, this was the ultimate test of resolve. Many were teenagers, boys from farms in Ohio or cities like New York, who had never imagined a hell like this. They were exhausted, their bodies aching from the day's combat, their minds reeling from what they had witnessed. The cold seeped into their bones, a damp, miserable chill that seemed to emanate from the very ground. Sleep was an impossible luxury. Every few minutes, a flare would hiss into the sky, casting the battlefield in a ghostly, greenish-white light. In those fleeting moments, the landscape was revealed in all its horror. The twisted remains of vehicles, the craters that pockmarked the earth, and the still forms of men who would never see another dawn. Amidst this chaos, the American medics, the bravest of the brave, moved through the darkness. Unarmed, they crawled from one foxhole to the next, following the sounds of pain. They were angels in the dark, whispering words of comfort, administering morphine, patching up wounds under the most impossible conditions. A touch on the shoulder, a sip of water from a canteen. These small acts of humanity were beacons of light in an ocean of darkness. They risked everything to save their comrades, their only protection the Red Cross on their helmets, an emblem the enemy didn't always respect. This night was a crucible, forging bonds between soldiers that would last a lifetime. In the shared terror of a foxhole, strangers became brothers. They shared their last cigarettes, their family stories, their hopes for a future that seemed impossibly distant. They checked on each other, a quiet question of "You still there, Mac?" Cutting through the noise, a simple affirmation of life. This shared experience, this reliance on the man next to you, was the glue that held the line together. But what truly held the line that night was more than just individual bravery. It was a doctrine, a philosophy of warfare, championed by their audacious commander, General George S. Patton. Patton's Third Army, and its spearhead, the 4th Armored Division, was built on 3 core principles: mobility, coordination, and flexibility. And on the night of March 6th, these principles were on full display. Mobility wasn't just about speed, it was about the ability to react. Even in the dark, American units were not static. Small patrols would slip out to reconnoiter, ensuring the Germans couldn't mount a surprise attack. Tanks and tank destroyers were repositioned to cover new threats, their engines muffled as they crept into better firing positions. This constant fluid adjustment kept the Germans guessing. Coordination was key. Radio operators, the unsung heroes of the signal corps, worked tirelessly through the night. Their headsets crackled with coded messages, relaying information between infantry, armor, and artillery. A request for fire support from a forward observer could, within minutes, bring a devastating barrage of high-explosive shells down on a suspected German assembly area. This seamless communication network acted as the division's nervous system, allowing it to feel and react to the enemy even in total blackness. The artillerymen, miles behind the front, were a constant, reassuring presence. Their guns fired throughout the night, a steady, rhythmic thunder that told the frontline troops they were not alone. And then there was flexibility. The American command structure, unlike the rigid hierarchy of their SS opponents, empowered junior officers and NCOs to make decisions on the spot. A platoon leader didn't have to wait for an order from a general miles away to shift his machine guns to a better field of fire. If a gap appeared in the line, a sergeant could take the initiative and plug it with his squad. This adaptability, this trust in the man on the ground, made the American line a resilient, self-healing organism. The SSCs, indoctrinated with a rigid, top-down ideology, expected a static, brittle defense. They found instead a flexible, dynamic one that bent but refused to break. The SS creed was one of fanatical, brutal belief, a belief that they were a master race destined for victory. But on this night, that creed was shattered against a superior military philosophy. Patton's doctrine wasn't about ideology. It was about practicality. It was about using speed and combined arms to disorient and destroy the enemy. It was about empowering soldiers to think and act independently. While the SS relied on fanaticism, the Americans relied on teamwork, technology, and tactics. The burning tanks were a testament to the fact that courage and belief, without superior strategy, were not enough. As the first hints of dawn began to gray the eastern sky on March 7th, the night of fire slowly subsided. The explosions became less frequent. The screams faded, and an eerie quiet settled over the battlefield. The surviving American soldiers, their faces smudged with dirt and gunpowder, their eyes red from exhaustion, watched the sunrise. They had done it Teadeld. The line was secure. They had faced the best the enemy had to offer in the terrifying confusion of night, and they had won. The doctrine of mobility, coordination, and flexibility had proven mightier than any SS creed. The Battle of Leibstandarte was over, but the lessons learned in the crucible of that fiery night would carry the 4th Armored Division all the way to the heart of Germany and to the end of the war. By early March 1945, the Allied war machine was grinding its way deep into the heart of Germany. On the Western Front, General George S. Patton's Third Army was a spearhead, relentlessly pushing eastward, chewing up German resistance. But even in its death throes, the Third Reich could still lash out with ferocious power. The First SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte, was one of its most formidable weapons, a hardened, elite unit that had fought on every front. When this division was unleashed against a small, isolated American task force near the town of Statkill, the odds looked grim. The American unit, a mix of infantry and armor, was caught off guard. They were outnumbered and outgunned, facing the might of Germany as the premier Panzer Division. The situation was desperate. 4 hours, the battle raged. American Sherman tanks, often considered inferior to their German counterparts, dueled with Panthers and Tigers. G as in foxholes held their ground against waves of battle-hardened SS infantry. The air crackled with the sounds of machine gun fire, artillery explosions, and the terrifying clash of metal on metal. The Americans were fighting for their lives, cut off from support, with communications strained to the breaking point. Back at headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. General Patton, known for his aggressive and often impatient nature, paced like a caged lion. He knew his men were in a tough spot. The First SS Panzer was a force to be reckoned with, and losing this position could create a dangerous gap in his advancing front line. Every report that trickled in painted a picture of a desperate struggle against overwhelming odds. Patton, a commander who prided himself on momentum and victory, could only wait. His entire strategy in the region hinged on these small-scale engagements, on the ability of his units to hold the line and keep pushing forward. The fate of the men at Statkill, and perhaps the pace of the entire advance, hung in the balance. Then, against all expectations, the news came. On the morning of March 7th, 1945, a message crackled over the radio. The American task force had held. They had weathered the storm. The relentless attacks of the First SS Panzer had finally broken against the unyielding wall of American resolve. The Germans, having taken significant losses and failed to achieve a breakthrough, had pulled back. Statkill was still in Allied hands. When word reached Patton, his reaction was one of sheer astonishment. He had expected his men to fight hard. They always did. But to hold out against the Leibstandarte, to face down one of the most feared units in the German army, and why not, was almost unbelievable. His astonishment quickly turned to immense pride. This wasn't a victory achieved by overwhelming numbers or massive air support. This was a victory of pure grit, courage, and ingenuity on the battlefield. The soldiers at Statkill hadn't just followed orders. They had adapted, improvised, and overcome. Tank crews had used clever tactics to outmaneuver the heavier German armor. Infantry squads had set up lethal crossfires and fought off attacks from multiple directions. Junior officers and NCOs had taken command when their superiors fell, making critical decisions under immense pressure. They had refused to break. They had looked the devil in the eye and made him blink first. As the dawn light broke on March 7th, reinforcements finally arrived. Rolling into the battered town of Statkill, they found a scene of devastation. The fields were littered with the smoking hulks of destroyed tanks, both American and German. The streets were scarred by shell craters and littered with debris. But amidst the destruction, the American flag still flew. The exhausted but triumphant defenders greeted the reinforcements, their faces grimy with soot and weariness, but their eyes shining with the light of victory. They had done the impossible. Patton wasn't a man who handed out praise lightly. He demanded excellence and was often harsh in his criticism. But this was different. He saw the engagement at Statkill not just as a successful defensive action, but as a perfect example of what he believed made the American soldier the best in the world. It was a demonstration of initiative, flexibility, and raw courage under fire. These were the qualities he valued above all others. He immediately ordered his staff to compile a detailed report of the battle. He wanted every detail documented. The tactics used by the tank crews, the defensive positions set up by the infantry, the command decisions made by the officers on the ground. He told his staff, "I want you to study this. Study every part of it." For Patton, Statkill was to become a teachable moment for the entire Third Army. He didn't want this incredible display of battlefield prowess to be just another line in a daily report. He wanted it to be a model, a case study in how to fight and win when the odds are stacked against you. He instructed that the lessons learned from Statkill be disseminated to other units. He wanted every officer, every NC, and every soldier in his command to understand how the small, beleaguered force had managed to stop a Panzer Division in its tracks. This was field improvisation at its finest. The American Gs hadn't relied on a rigid, textbook plan. They had used the terrain to their advantage, turning hedgerows and buildings into fortresses. They had coordinated their fire, with bazooka teams working in tandem with machine gunners to create deadly kill zones. The tankers, knowing their Shermans were vulnerable hit-on, had used their speed and maneuverability to hit the German tanks from the flanks and rear, where their armor was weaker. It was a symphony of decentralized, small unit tactics, executed with deadly precision under the most extreme pressure. And beyond the tactics, there was the sheer courage. Patton knew that no plan, no matter how brilliant, could succeed without the bravery of the men carrying it out. The men at Statkill had faced down their own fear. They had seen their friends fall, their vehicles destroyed, and yet they had kept fighting. They fought through the night, low on ammunition, with exhaustion gnawing at them, but their morale never broke. It was this indomitable spirit, this refusal to accept defeat, that impressed Patton the most. He saw it as the embodiment of the American fighting spirit. The story of the defense of Statkill spread through the ranks of the Third Army, becoming a source of inspiration. It was a powerful reminder that even in the face of elite enemy units and superior firepower, victory was possible. It reinforced the idea that the quality of the soldier was more important than the quality of his equipment. For the men who fought there, it was a brutal, terrifying experience they would never forget. But for General Patton and the Allied war effort, it was a shining example of heroism and a tactical masterpiece that would be studied and admired. The orders he gave that day ensured that the courage shown at Statkill would not be a fleeting moment of glory, but a lasting lesson in the art of war. March 8, 1945. Imagine standing in the ruins of a town that has been erased from the map. This was Statkill, but it wasn't just buildings that were gone. A silence hung in the air, a heavy, deafening quiet that only comes after the loudest, most terrifying noise imaginable has finally stopped. The air itself tasted of ash and iron. This was the scene that greeted the survivors. A landscape painted in shades of gray and black, punctuated by the twisted, skeletal remains of tanks and trucks. It was a metal graveyard. Among the rubble, shattered helmets lay like discarded shells, each one telling a silent story of a soldier who had stood his ground. The cost of taking this small, strategically insignificant town had been staggering. For the American forces who fought here, the price was almost unbearable. Over 70% of them were casualties. Think about that for a moment. More than 2 out of every 3 men who entered the fight were either killed or wounded. It's a number so large it's hard to comprehend. These weren't statistics. They were individuals, each with a family, a history, a future that was cut short or forever altered in this inferno. But this was no ordinary battle against a run-of-the-mill enemy unit. The force they had faced, and ultimately broken, was a veteran Panzer Division, one that had been at the very core of Hitler's military might since the early days of the war. This division was a symbol of the Third Reich's power, a unit that had rolled through France, fought on the brutal Eastern Front, and was now making its last stand on German soil. They were experienced, fanatically loyal, and equipped with some of the most feared tanks of the war. Destroying them wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological blow to the heart of the enemy. The men who survived the battle for Statkill walked through the charred ruins, not with a sense of triumphant celebration, but with a quiet, somber understanding of what they had endured. Every step was a reminder of a fallen friend. Every blackened wall whispered the echoes of the fight. In this place, victory didn't feel like a parade or a medal. It felt like breathing. Survival itself was the only triumph that mattered. They had paid an incredible price, but in doing so, they had torn a hole in the fabric of the enemy's war machine, a hole that could not be repaired. Let's take a closer look at the American unit that bore this immense cost. They were a mix of green replacements and seasoned veterans, thrown together by the relentless demands of the front line. Many of the newer soldiers had barely been in Europe for a few months. They had learned to be soldiers, not in training camps, but in the crucible of combat. The veterans, those who had survived the hedgerows of Normandy and the frozen forests of the Ardennes, carried the weight of experience and the ghosts of past battles on their shoulders. They were led by officers who had to make impossible decisions. Send men to a certain death to take an objective, hold a position against impossible odds. Every command was a gamble with human lives. In the chaos of Statkill, leadership wasn't about grand speeches. It was about a captain pointing to a ruined building and saying, "We need to take that house," knowing full well the cost. It was about a sergeant pulling a wounded man to safety under a hail of machine gun fire. It was about the unspoken bond between soldiers who relied on each other for their very existence. The battle itself was a brutal, close-quarters affair. It wasn't a fight across open fields, but a desperate struggle from street to street, house to house, and even room to room. Every corner could hide a machine gun nest, every pile of rubble a sniper. The Panzers, the feared German tanks, used the narrow streets to their advantage. Their powerful cannons, capable of turning a brick house into dust with a single shot. The American infantry had to counter them with sticky bombs and sheer, raw courage, hunting these steel beasts in the urban labyrinth. Imagine the sound, the constant, deafening roar of tank engines, the sharp crack of rifles, the staccato drumming of machine guns, and the earth-shattering boom of artillery. Debris rained down constantly. The sky, filled with smoke and fire, turned day into a perpetual twilight. For the soldiers, in the thick of it, the world shrank to the few yards in front of them. Their only reality was the immediate threat, the next corner, the next doorway. As the days of fighting bled into one another, exhaustion became as deadly an enemy as the Germans. Men fought on pure adrenaline, with little food, less water, and almost no sleep. The line between living and dead blurred, yet they pushed on. Why? They fought for each other. The man in the foxhole next to them was their brother, their family. They fought because going forward was the only way to make it end. They fought because they believed, deep down, that their sacrifice had a purpose. When the last pocket of resistance was finally silenced on March 8th, the silence that followed was profound. The victors were a shadow of the force that had begun the assault. Medics moved through the ruins, their work a grim and endless task. The living helped the wounded, sharing their last cigarettes, offering a sip of water from a canteen. There were no cheers, no shouts of glory. There was only a shared, weary look of men who had been to hell and somehow, against all odds, had come back. They had destroyed a cornerstone of Hitler's army. The German division, once a proud and fearsome force, ceased to exist. Its tanks were smoldering wrecks, its soldiers captured or killed. This victory, and others like it all along the front, was another nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. It shortened the war. It saved lives elsewhere. But for the men in Statkill, that larger strategic picture was distant and abstract. Their victory was measured in the next sunrise, in the simple act of being alive when so many of their comrades were not. The story of Statkill is a microcosm of the entire war in Europe. It's a story of incredible bravery and devastating loss. It reminds us that victory in war is never clean or simple. It is always paid for in blood and sorrow. The twisted steel and shattered helmets left behind in the rubble weren't just the debris of battle. They were monuments. They were a testament to the cost of freedom, a price paid by a generation of ordinary men who were called upon to do extraordinary things. Their sacrifice ensured that the dark ideology they fought against would be defeated, and their legacy is the world we live in today. We must never forget the price they paid in countless places like